The autumn breeze carried a hint of winter as Elena Martinez walked through the gates of Fort Henderson, her weathered combat boots making soft sounds against the asphalt. At 48, she moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to navigate the world despite invisible wounds. Her graying hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a faded desert camouflage jacket that had seen better days, much better days. The jacket's fabric was worn thin at the elbows, the colors bleached by countless desert suns and washing machines. What most people couldn't see were the small holes near the left shoulder, bullet holes that had been carefully mended with thread that didn't quite match. Above her heart, where unit patches typically resided, there was only a faded outline, the ghost of something that had once been there. Elena had come to Fort Henderson for a simple errand, to pick up medical records from the base hospital for her ongoing disability claim. After 3 years of bureaucratic battles with the VA, she had learned to expect nothing and hope for little. The jacket wasn't a fashion statement, it was armor against a world that had forgotten her service. The base exchange buzzed with afternoon activity. Young soldiers browsed electronics while military families stocked up on household essentials. Elena made her way to the customer service counter, medical forms clutched in her weathered hands. The fluorescent lights seemed harsh after the natural daylight outside. As she waited in line, she overheard a conversation behind her. 2 young sergeants, probably in their mid-20s, were discussing weekend plans. Their uniforms were crisp, their patches bright and new. "Check out that jacket," one whispered, not quite quietly enough. Sergeant Anderson, according to his name tape, nudged his companion. "Looks like it survived Desert Storm." Sergeant Torres snickered. "More like she found it at a surplus store. Probably thinks it makes her look military." Elena's jaw tightened slightly, but she kept her eyes forward. She had heard worse. Much worse. "I hate stolen valor cases," Anderson continued, his voice carrying despite his attempt at discretion. "At least make an effort to look authentic. That thing's falling apart." "And what's with that faded patch area?" Torres added. Couldn't even commit to the lie properly. Other customers began to notice the conversation. Some looked uncomfortable, others curious. Elena felt the familiar burn of shame mixed with anger, not shame for her service, but shame that she couldn't prove it to people who would never understand. When her turn came, the customer service representative, a young woman with kind eyes, smiled professionally. "How can I help you today, ma'am?" "I need to update my contact information for medical records," Elena said quietly, sliding her paperwork across the counter. The representative, whose name tag read Jennifer, looked at the forms with growing confusion. "Ma'am, these forms indicate you're a veteran, but I don't see a DD-214 or veteran ID card." Elena had been through this dance before. "My service records are classified. I have a letter from the Department of Defense explaining the situation." She produced a worn envelope containing official letterhead and multiple signatures. Jennifer examined it carefully, clearly out of her depth. "I'm sorry, but I need to call my supervisor," Jennifer said apologetically. "We don't usually handle classified service records." Behind Elena, the 2 sergeants exchanged knowing looks. "Here we go," Anderson muttered. "The classified service excuse. Classic." Staff Sergeant Williams approached the counter with the efficient manner of someone used to solving problems. He was older than the customer service rep, probably a lifer nearing retirement. His eyes held the wisdom that came from years of military service. "What seems to be the issue?" he asked, taking the paperwork from Jennifer. Elena explained her situation again, her voice steady despite the growing audience. Williams examined the documents with more care than Jennifer had, his expression growing increasingly serious. "Ma'am," he said finally, "these documents are legitimate, but they're above my clearance level to verify. I can't access the database they reference." "Then how am I supposed to update my information?" Elena asked, though she already knew the answer. "You'd need someone with higher clearance to vouch for you," Williams said reluctantly. "Or you'd need to go through official channels to get portions of your record declassified." The sergeants behind Elena were no longer trying to hide their commentary. 3 years of trying to get records declassified? Torres said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "That's dedication to a lie." "Should probably report this," Anderson agreed. "Stolen valor is a federal crime." Elena turned to face them for the first time. Her gray eyes, marked by laugh lines and worry lines in equal measure, met theirs steadily. "Is there something you'd like to say to me directly, Sergeant?" Anderson straightened, realizing he'd been called out. "Ma'am, we're just concerned about people impersonating military personnel." "And what makes you think I'm impersonating anyone?" Elena asked calmly. Well, ma'am, Torres jumped in, emboldened by what he perceived as righteousness. You're wearing military gear, claiming classified service that can't be verified, and you don't have proper documentation. Elena nodded slowly. I see. And what unit were you with in Afghanistan, Sergeant Torres? Torres blinked, surprised by the question. I served with the 173rd Airborne, ma'am. 2 deployments. Good unit, Elena acknowledged. And you, Sergeant Anderson? 1st Cavalry Division, ma'am. Iraq and Afghanistan. Also respectable service, Elena said. Tell me, in all your deployments, did you ever encounter units whose mission parameters you weren't briefed on? Operations that happened in your area but weren't in your daily intelligence reports. The sergeants exchanged glances, their confidence wavering slightly. Because, Elena continued, if you served in combat zones for any length of time, you would know that not every American unit operates under standard protocols. Some of us were never supposed to exist in the first place. Before the sergeants could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. A small entourage entered the exchange. 2 colonels, several aides, and at the center, a man whose bearing commanded immediate respect even before anyone noticed the 4 stars on his uniform. General Robert Hayes was a legend in military circles. A combat veteran who had risen through the ranks the hard way, he was known for his no-nonsense approach and his fierce loyalty to his soldiers. At 62, he still looked like he could outmarch men half his age. He was deep in conversation with one of his colonels, discussing logistics for an upcoming training exercise. The 82nd needs those supplies staged by Thursday, he was saying. I don't want to hear about delays when lives could depend on. He stopped mid-sentence. His eyes had found Elena across the crowded exchange, specifically the faded outline on her jacket. The general's expression shifted from routine military business to something approaching shock. The entourage continued a few steps before realizing their commanding officer had stopped. They turned, confused, following his gaze to the woman in the worn desert camouflage jacket. General Hayes handed his briefing folder to the nearest aide without looking away from Elena. Then, in a gesture that stunned everyone present, he came to attention and rendered a perfect military salute. The exchange fell silent. Every conversation stopped. Every movement ceased. In military protocol, saluting in civilian clothes and in indoor settings was highly irregular. For a 4-star general to salute first was almost unprecedented. Elena stood frozen for a moment, grocery basket forgotten in her hand. Then, muscle memory from decades past took over. She carefully set down her basket and returned the salute with the crisp precision of a soldier who had never forgotten her training. Captain Martinez, General Hayes said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. Operation Sand Ghost, 2001. You were with the 5th Special Operations Squadron. It wasn't a question. It was recognition. Yes, sir, Elena replied, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. The general lowered his salute and Elena followed suit. Around them, the silence stretched as military personnel and civilians alike tried to process what they were witnessing. Your team saved my life, General Hayes said simply. And the lives of 43 other Americans who were supposed to die in that compound in Kandahar. Elena's eyes closed briefly, memories flooding back despite her efforts to keep them buried. Operation Sand Ghost, a mission so classified that most of the participants didn't know the full scope until years later, if ever. Sir, she said quietly, that operation is still above top secret. I know, the general interrupted. But some truths need to be told, classification be damned. He looked around the crowded exchange, his gaze settling on the 2 sergeants who had been mocking Elena minutes earlier. What you're looking at, General Hayes announced to the room, is Captain Elena Martinez, formerly of the 5th Special Operations Squadron. Her unit doesn't officially exist. Her missions never officially happened. And the 43 Americans who came home alive from a Taliban compound in 2001 officially were never there. Sergeant Anderson and Sergeant Torres looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. The general continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Captain Martinez's team volunteered for a mission with a 90% casualty rate. They went in without support, without backup, and without hope of rescue if things went wrong. Their job was to buy time for a larger rescue operation by drawing enemy fire away from the compound where American hostages were being held. Elena shifted uncomfortably, and used to having her service discussed so openly after decades of silence. The plan called for her team to create a diversion and hold a perimeter for 30 minutes, Hayes continued. They held it for 4 hours. 4 hours against overwhelming odds, while extraction helicopters pulled out hostages and wounded personnel. He looked directly at Elena. "How many of your team made it out, Captain?" "2, sir," Elena said softly. "Myself and Sergeant Major Williams. He died from his wounds 3 months later at Walter Reed." The general's expression hardened. "So you're the sole survivor of a unit that officially never existed, carrying the memory of teammates whose sacrifice can never be properly honored because the mission they died completing never officially happened." In the silence that followed, Staff Sergeant Williams stepped forward from behind the customer service counter. His face had gone pale as the pieces fell into place. "Ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I owe you an apology." "We all do." Elena shook her head. "You couldn't have known, Staff Sergeant. That was the point." General Hayes turned to address the 2 sergeants who had been questioning Elena's authenticity. Sergeant Anderson, Sergeant Torres stepped forward. The 2 young men approached, their earlier confidence completely evaporated. They came to attention, knowing they were about to face consequences for their behavior. "What you've witnessed here today," the general said, "is why we never judge a book by its cover. Why we treat every claim of service with respect until proven otherwise. Captain Martinez has been fighting the VA for years to get recognition for injuries sustained in classified operations. She's been denied benefits, questioned, and mocked by people who have no idea what she sacrificed." Anderson found his voice first. "Sir, we had no idea." "No, you didn't," Hayes cut him off. "And that's not entirely your fault. But your behavior was unacceptable regardless. You publicly humiliated a veteran based on assumptions and prejudice." Torres stepped forward. "Sir, how do we make this right?" The general looked at Elena, giving her the opportunity to respond. She studied the 2 young sergeants, seeing in their faces the same dedication to service that had once driven her. "You learn from this," she said finally. "You remember that not everyone who served looks the way you expect them to look. Some of us were never supposed to be remembered at all." General Hayes turned his attention to Staff Sergeant Williams. "What was the issue with updating Captain Martinez's records?" Williams straightened. "Sir, her service records are classified above our access level. We can't verify her veteran status through normal channels." "Consider it verified," the general said with finality. "I'll have my office send the necessary authorizations within the hour." He looked at Elena. "What other issues are you having with the VA?" Elena hesitated, and used to having such powerful advocacy. "Medical claims, sir. The injuries I sustained during San Ghost, the VA can't treat what they can't acknowledge happened." The general's jaw tightened. "That ends today. I'll personally ensure your medical records are declassified at the appropriate level." He paused. "What injuries are we talking about, Captain?" "Shrapnel in my left leg and back, sir. Hearing loss from IED explosions. And..." She hesitated. "And?" "PTSD, sir. From watching my team die while I couldn't help them." The silence in the exchange was profound. General Hayes nodded slowly, understanding evident in his expression. "Captain, I want you to report to my office tomorrow at 0800. We're going to fix this properly." He turned to his aide. "Contact the VA regional director. Tell him I need to see him first thing in the morning. And get me everything we have on Operation San Ghost declassification status." "Yes, sir," the aide replied, making rapid notes. As the general prepared to leave, he stopped and looked back at Elena. "Captain, there's something else. Your team was recommended for the Silver Star posthumously. The awards were never processed because of classification issues." Elena's eyes widened. "Sir, I never knew." "Bureaucratic oversight," Hayes said grimly. "Your teammates deserve recognition, even if it's 20 years late. And so do you." He gestured to her jacket. "That patch you're missing, it was the 5th Special Operations Squadron insignia, wasn't it?" Elena nodded, unable to speak. "I'll make sure you get a replacement. It's time you could wear it with pride instead of hiding it." As the general's entourage prepared to leave, he made one final announcement to the crowded exchange. "Let this be a lesson to everyone here. The person standing next to you might be a hero whose story can never be told. Treat every veteran with the respect they deserve, because you never know what they've sacrificed for your freedom." Elena Martinez walked through the same exchange, but everything had changed. The faded desert camouflage jacket had been professionally cleaned and restored. Above her heart, the 5th Special Operations Squadron patch was clearly visible, along with a small silver star pin that gleamed in the fluorescent lighting. Her medical treatment had been approved within a week of General Hayes's intervention. Physical therapy was helping with her mobility, and counseling was finally addressing the PTSD she had carried alone for so long. The bureaucratic maze that had trapped her for years had dissolved overnight once the right person made the right phone calls. More importantly, she was no longer alone with her memories. A small memorial had been established at Fort Henderson honoring the members of classified units who had died in operations that officially never happened. Her teammates' names were finally carved in stone, their sacrifice acknowledged even if their specific actions remained secret. As she walked through the exchange, she noticed Sergeant Anderson near the electronics section. He saw her coming and immediately stood straighter, offering a respectful nod. "Good afternoon, Captain Martinez," he said. "Afternoon, Sergeant Anderson. How's your family?" "Good, ma'am. Thank you for asking." He paused. "Ma'am, I wanted you to know, what happened that day, it changed how I look at things. I've started volunteering at the VA hospital, helping veterans navigate the system." Elena smiled, the first genuine smile she'd managed in the exchange in years. "That's good to hear, Sergeant. Sometimes the best lessons come from our mistakes." "Yes, ma'am." "And ma'am? Thank you for your service. Your real service." As Elena continued through the store, she reflected on how much had changed. The shadows she had lived in for 2 decades hadn't completely lifted, they never would. Some operations, some sacrifices, would always remain classified. But she was no longer invisible, no longer fighting alone. Near the customer service counter, she saw Staff Sergeant Williams helping another veteran with paperwork. When he noticed her, he offered a small salute, which she returned with a nod. The story of the woman in the worn jacket had spread throughout the military community, becoming something of a legend. Not the specific details, those remained classified, but the broader lesson about looking beyond appearances, about the invisible veterans who carried invisible wounds from invisible wars. General Hayes had used Elena's story, with her permission and appropriate security clearances, in officer training programs across the military. The lesson was simple: never assume you know someone's story based on how they look. Elena had been invited to speak at military academies and veteran organizations. She couldn't share the details of her missions, but she could talk about transition, about the challenges facing veterans with classified service records, about the importance of supporting each other. The 2 sergeants who had mocked her jacket had become 2 of her strongest advocates. They had learned a lesson that would stay with them throughout their careers, that heroism doesn't always wear a uniform, and sacrifice doesn't always come with recognition. As Elena prepared to leave the exchange that day 3 months later, she ran her fingers over the restored patch on her jacket. Few people would ever know its true significance, that it had been worn by Captain Sarah Chen, Elena's team leader, who had died holding a doorway so Elena and the hostages could escape. Sarah's family had given Elena the jacket after the funeral, along with a letter Sarah had written to be opened only if she didn't come home. In it, Sarah had written, "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it back. Please don't let them forget us. Don't let them forget that we were here, that we mattered, that we chose to serve even when no one would ever know." For 20 years, Elena had honored that request in silence. Now finally she could honor it in the light. The jacket had been mocked as a fraud, a costume, a lie. In truth, it was a memorial, a promise kept, a legacy preserved. It carried the weight of sacrifice that could never be fully acknowledged, the memory of heroes whose names would never be in history books. As Elena walked out of the exchange and into the afternoon sunlight, she felt the weight of that responsibility, not as a burden anymore but as an honor. She was the keeper of their stories, the guardian of their memory, the living testament to their sacrifice. The general had been right. Some truths needed to be told, classification be damned. Not all of them, not all at once, but enough to ensure that heroes weren't forgotten, that sacrifice wasn't dismissed, that the invisible warriors who had served in invisible wars were finally, properly recognized. Behind her, the exchange continued its daily rhythm, but the lesson remained. Never judge a book by its cover, because sometimes that cover is protecting something sacred that can never be fully revealed, only honored. 6 months after that pivotal day in the exchange, Elena received a call from General Hayes. He was organizing a new program for veterans with classified service records, helping them navigate the complex process of getting appropriate recognition and benefits. "I need someone who understands the system from both sides," he had said. "Someone who's been through the bureaucratic nightmare and came out the other side. Someone who can help other invisible veterans find their way back into the light." Elena had accepted without hesitation. It was time to ensure that no other veteran would have to fight alone for 20 years to get the help they had earned. The program started small, a handful of veterans whose service records were buried in classified files, whose sacrifices had been forgotten by bureaucracy if not by history. But word spread quickly through the invisible network of special operations veterans, the ones who had served in units that didn't exist on missions that never happened. Elena's office at Fort Henderson became a beacon for those who had served in shadows. They came quietly, carrying their own worn jackets and faded memories, their own invisible wounds from invisible wars. And Elena met each one with understanding, with recognition, with the promise that they would no longer have to carry their burdens alone. The jacket still hung in her closet, carefully preserved. She wore it sometimes to meetings with other veterans, not as a symbol of her own service, but as a reminder that behind every faded uniform, every worn patch, every invisible veteran, there was a story of sacrifice that deserved to be honored, even if it could never be fully told. And in the exchange at Fort Henderson where it all began, a small plaque had been installed near the customer service counter. It read simply, "In honor of all who served in ways that cannot be acknowledged, in places that cannot be named, for missions that officially never happened. Your sacrifice is not forgotten." Below it was a simple line that had become Elena's motto, Sarah's final gift to the world: "Not all heroes wear their stories on their sleeves. Some carry them in their hearts, waiting for the right moment to let them see the light." The woman in the worn jacket had finally come home.